Livet kan være et eventyr, intenst, kvikt,
langsomt eller trist.
måske med op- og nedture.
Men ifølge psykiatere kan alle livets dele stemples som psykiske sygdomme.
Virkelig? Som hvad?
Lad os sige, man er oprevet efter man har slået op med nogen. Det kunne kaldes en depression.
Hvad hvis man bliver nervøs, når man skal tale offentligt?
Angstforstyrrelse.
Eller man snakker meget og er super aktiv?
Manisk.
Det lyder absurd.
Det gør det.
Men hvor udbredt er det?
Lad os spørge.
How many people do you know that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Diagnosed with a mental, God, off the top of my head, maybe one person that I know who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder.
Probably just one.
So, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe in the 3 or 4 range.
4 or 5, maybe 5.
6 people in the household.
6, 7.
10.
A dozen or so.
About 20.
How about 30?
Would definitely be in the hundreds for sure.
The total number of people that I know in my lifetime has been diagnosed with a mental disorder probably fall around the range of 100 to 150, and I'm 23 years old.
Wow, men hvor kommer alle de forstyrrelser fra?
Fra Diagnostisk og Statistisk Manual over psykiske forstyrrelser og ICD-10 fra psykiatrien. DSM er 943 sider lang og dækker ligesom ICD-10 alt fra depression og angst til stammen, tobaksafhængighed, frygt for edderkopper, mareridt, problemer med regning og spædbarnsforstyrrelser, alt genfortolket og kaldt hjernesygdomme.
Men nogle har alvorlige problemer i livet.
Helt absolut, men psykiaterne reducerer det til, at der er noget galt med hjernen.
Lad mig lige få det på det rene. Psykiatere har en bog om livets problemer, genfortolket som psykiske forstyrrelser.
Netop.
Wow, så er det vel videnskabeligt underbygget.
Det skulle man tro, men nej. Psykiatere indrømmede det selv ved en af deres nylige konferencer. Hør her.
DSM is made up by committees of men who have political opinion, and women too, who have biases and political opinions. And so there isn't nearly as much science in DSM as there ought to be.
Like in the previous one, people had a meeting in the bathroom and they decided that something should be in there, and then they would go and propose it to the whole committee.
You have this kind of lumping together of several observations, and when you get enough of them in one tent, you got a diagnosis.
DSM system is not the real system of the diagnosis.
A lot of the disorders that are in there haven't necessarily been rigorously validated.
It's just the best tool that we have available, but it is not perfect.
It's so useless that if you give me a patient and the DSM, I'll make at least 20 diagnoses on the same patient.
You have to take it with a grain of salt anyway.
It's actually getting more and more complicated.
We're left with diagnosing things on the basis of checklists and questionnaires, which leaves us sort of out of, as you said, the rest of medicine because we don't have a biological test.
Forbløffende.
Manglen på videnskab i DSM er en offentlig hemmelighed. Her er, hvad nogle professionelle har at sige om det.
The DSM is a sham. It's been described as a house of cards. Why? Because the diagnoses are theoretical. They're not based on scientific measurements.
It's sort of a shaky level built on another shaky level, built on another shaky level.
It is flimsy and that it is easily collapsible under the scrutiny of critical thinking.
If you just pull one little fragment of the reasoning aside and questioning thoroughly, you'll find it doesn't stand up, and then that means that the whole organism collapses because you've got some wrong premises in there somewhere. In fact, they're all over the place.
It is indeed a house of cards because it's predicated on not a solid structure. It is built to create an apparently legitimate edifice, which results in a diagnosis. But any serious inquiry will show it to be illegitimate.
Here, I tell you. With schizophrenia.
Hvis DSM ikke er baseret på videnskab, hvad er den så baseret på?
Tja, det begyndte med et ønske fra psykiatrien og psykologien om at blive accepteret af den medicinske verden.
We psychologists have always desperately wanted to be accepted as a real science, as a true science. Now, what the early psychologists did was they looked around and they saw what other scientists were doing, and they decided to emulate them.
Modern approaches to classifying psychiatric disorders dates from the 19th century.
Nearly all the clinical concepts we have today originate from that time. Probably the most important of all was a chap called Emil Kraepelin, who worked first of all in Heidelberg and then in Munich.
Har aldrig hørt om ham.
Emil Kraepelin er kendt som ophavsmanden til psykiatrisk klassifikation. Han var den første, der klassificerede, hvad han troede var biologiske sygdomme i hjernen. Der var dementia praecox, som nu kaldes skizofren, maniodepressiv lidelse og paranoid psykose. Alle begreber, som stadig findes i DSM og ICD-10 i dag.
Er det alt? 3 forstyrrelser?
Ja, kun 3. Men Kraepelins system blev hurtigt populært. Hør her.
Kraepelin's system caught on very quickly, not only in the German-speaking world, but also in the English-speaking world, in the United States and Britain. It caught on because up to that point, nobody had an agreed way of talking about patients.
So in the early 1950s, there was compiled Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, there are very few statistics in the book. Disorder is used essentially as a euphemism for illness. This is a book which catalogues mental illnesses for which no medical sign has ever been discovered.
Dette primitive hæfte var 130 sider langt og inkluderede 112 psykiske forstyrrelser. Kort sammenlignet med den nuværende DSM, men meget længere end Kraepelin nogensinde havde forestillet sig.
Hvorfor så mange?
For ved at definere mere og mere af livet som unormalt, kunne psykiaterne få fingre i enorme pengesummer fra myndighederne.
Definere livet? Hvad mener du?
Tja, ting som at holde vejret, bide negle, sut på tommelfinger, gå i søvne, være ineffektiv, selv homoseksualitet.
Det er for latterligt. De tilføjede alle dem, så de havde nogen at behandle.
Og flere. Og så kom den anden udgave, DSM-2, i 1968, som havde 178 forstyrrelser, igen for at få flere sygesikringspenge fra myndighederne. For at kunne gøre det internationalt, blev DSM-2 tilpasset til International Classification of Disease, ICD, en bog, der i vid udstrækning bruges i Europa og rundt om i verden, som ud over psykiatriske diagnoser også havde rigtige medicinske sygdomme.
Så det var sådan, psykiatriske forstyrrelser blev accepteret af den medicinske verden?
Det var en begyndelse, men DSM-2 var stadig ikke videnskabelig, da den var stærkt påvirket. Ikke af kliniske tester, men af Sigmund Freuds teorier.
Så må der have været mange neuroser i den bog, ikke?
Jep, men de vidste ikke, hvad der forårsagede dem, og de ledte ikke engang efter en årsag.
Inclusion of a disorder in the classification does not require that there be knowledge about its etiology. So in other words, to make a diagnosis, you really don't need to bother with cause and effect. You don't need to know what causes the condition.
Lige et øjeblik. Hvis DSM ikke siger, hvad der forårsager den psykiske forstyrrelser, hvordan opdager psykiaterne dem så overhovedet?
Svaret vil måske overraske dig.
New diseases are being invented all the time, and I want to emphasize the word invented, because when it comes to psychiatry, mental illnesses are not discovered, they're invented.
The way the system works in terms of diagnosis is that every few years a group of psychiatrists and psychologists sit around in a room and vote on new diagnoses.
Og det er videnskab ufatteligt.
Bare rolig, det er ikke kun dig.
The diseases are voted on? What do you mean?
Did you say, are they voted into existence?
Or voted?
As in created.
Oh, man.
I think that's kind of ridiculous.
It's crazy that you would vote. I definitely don't agree.
I don't agree with it at all.
Mental disorders should be based on scientific research.
I have been led to believe that it's all based on medicine and science.
So I'm kind of shocked to find that out.
Ja, også mig.
Der er mere. Psykiske forstyrrelser indstemmes i DSM, men indimellem bliver de også stemt ud igen. For eksempel blev homoseksualitet beskrevet i DSM 1 og 2 som en psykisk lidelse. Her er, hvordan chefredaktøren for DSM 3, Robert Spitzer, forklarede det.
I came up with a definition in 1973 that made it possible to argue that homosexuality was not a mental disorder.
On a vote, essentially, at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, it was removed.
Now, did they discover that homosexuality was not a disease through scientific processes? No. It was included for political reasons, and it was removed for political reasons.
And the end result is a vote. It's a supposed democracy. So to call it science is is a complete fabrication.
Så DSM er faktisk politisk, ikke videnskabeligt?
Ja.
Jeg troede, psykiatere gerne ville regnes for at være læger.
Du har ret, derfor måtte de få manualen til at se meget mere videnskabelig ud.
Hvilket den ikke var, så hvad gjorde de?
De besluttede, at den næste udgave af DSM skulle være helt anderledes. Det var en beslutning, som totalt ændrede psykiatrien.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living now essentially had to be redefined. And they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So hence we have DSM-3, which is the third edition, which was published in 1980.
Under Spitzer forkastede de psykiatere, der redigerede DSM-3, freudiansk psykologi og erklærede, at fra nu af ville psykiatriske diagnoser kun være biologisk betingede.
Så til sidst blev de altså videnskabelige?
Nej, faktisk overhovedet ikke. I realiteten blev de politiske skænderier over, hvilke forstyrrelser der skulle tilføjes, og hvilke skulle udelades, endnu mere latterlige. Her er, hvad en psykiater havde at sige om det.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Og det er, hvad et andet medlem af det beslutningstagende DSM-panel sagde.
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Det lyder som om de havde en diagnostisk håndbog, der så mere videnskabelig ud, men ikke indeholdt mere videnskab end før.
Samtidig svulmede antallet af forstyrrelser i DSM-3 op til 259. Men for at sælge ideen om, at psykiatri var egentlig lægevidenskab, måtte de give det endnu en drejning med en imponerende videnskabelig lydende teori.
But with DSM-3 from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalization of psychiatry. And the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
Stop en halv. Kemisk hvad?
Kemisk ubalanceteorien. Den blev fremsat i 1965 i et forsøg på at forklare, hvordan depression måske var forårsaget af en ubalance af kemikalier i hjernen.
Fortæl.
Joseph Schildkraut formulerede en teori om, at fordi psykiatriske lægemidler ændrer niveauet af disse kemikalier, så må psykiske sygdomme forårsages af for meget eller for lidt af dem.
Er det ikke den omvendte rækkefølge?
Jo, det er lidt ligesom at sige, at fordi aspirin stopper hovedpinen, så er hovedpinen forårsaget af aspirinmangel.
Ja, det kan jeg godt se.
Men det var overbevisende nok til at give psykiatri og DSM-3 den overfladiske aura af videnskab, som Robert Spitzer udtrykte det.
Psychiatry felt now, gee, we're more scientific, we're part of medicine.
Så det virkede?
Ja, og psykiaterne og lægemiddelindustrien har lige siden utrætteligt spredt teorien om kemisk ubalance til både lægestanden og offentligheden.
If you are one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame.
Prestige is thought to work by affecting the levels of 2 chemicals in the brain.
It works to correct chemical imbalances in the brain, which may be related to symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
Cymbalta works on serotonin,
and norepinephrine.
Hundreds of thousands of patients have been prescribed Abilify. Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Call your doctor.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Prestige is a key in helping to treat my depression. Ask your doctor about Prestige.
You come to my office, and I say to you, well, you describe what's going on in your life and your symptoms, and I say, well, it's clear to me that you've got a chemical imbalance, and we're going to write you a prescription for this. The truth of the matter is, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
There's no test out there that they can depend on that tells you have a chemical imbalance.
There's actually, in fact, dozens of studies showing that there isn't any measurable imbalance. So psychiatrists will explain to patients all the time, this is just like diabetes. In diabetes, you have low insulin, we have to readjust the insulin level. In depression, you have low serotonin, we have to readjust the serotonin level. But actually, we have already proven that there's nothing wrong with serotonin levels. It's completely a myth, disproven by our own evidence.
I had a psychiatrist. He said that, in his professional opinion, this child had ADHD, a chemical imbalance of the brain. And when he was questioned on the witness stand as an expert witness for the state, he was asked if they had done an MRI. He said no. He was questioned if they had done a CAT scan. He said no. He was asked if they had done any bodily fluid check known to medical science to prove that this child had a chemical imbalance of the brain. He says no. And when he was asked how he arrived at this ADHD diagnosis, a chemical imbalance of the brain, it came down to that he had counseled and observed this child for 2 hours, and half of the time was observing. How do you arrive at a diagnosis of a chemical imbalance of the brain by talking to a child and observing them for 2 hours? You don't, okay? It's pure guesswork.
Wow, mener du det alvorligt?
Se selv efter. Her er, hvad der skete, da en person med et skjult kamera gik til flere forskellige psykiatere og bad om at blive undersøgt for en sindslidelse.
Of any scientific test?
Not that I'm prepared to do this time.
So you getting that I have adjustment, what is it?
Adjustment disorder, mixed emotional thinking. It just means situational stress.
Right,
it's a formal diagnosis.
But I'm saying, just where do you get that from?
I take you at face value.
In terms of diagnosis, there's no way that I can x-ray or project or allow.
So it's very hard to have anything to measure, because whatever's going wrong is happening in there, and we just can't go in and open up, somebody's skull and scoop something out to measure.
Right now, we don't have an x-ray or a blood test. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is not clear.
The diagnosis is for insurance, and I'm not really trying to think too much in terms of diagnosis. I don't really see that as my main job here to make a diagnosis, except give something to the insurance that's reasonably accurate.
But we don't even really know what's going wrong in the brain. So all the things that we found were found by accident.
Jeg er målløs. Psykiatriske diagnoser er baseret udelukkende på individuel vurdering.
Lige meget hvad de gør, så gør de noget galt. BBC lavede endda et program med 10 frivillige. 5 af dem var normale, og 5 havde tidligere fået en diagnose som sindslidende. De blev undersøgt af 3 kendte psykiatriske eksperter, som så blev bedt om at afgøre, hvem der var hvem.
Nå for pokker.
Se nu her.
We think that it's likely that you've had a history of bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
You're wrong.
Okay.
We've come to the conclusion that at some time you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder.
You're wrong.
We were wondering whether at some point in your life maybe that you had suffered from a significant psychiatric problem of some kind or other.
No.
Not at all?
You are wrong.
All right, okay.
3 wrong diagnoses in a row. After a whole week of observation, the panel have identified just 2 out of 5 disorders.
Ikke meget videnskab der.
Nej, det har du ret i.
Okay, I'm in. And
I got a pair of compulsive disorders here.
Jeg har et spørgsmål. Hvordan kan psykiatere kalde sig evidensbaseret, når de ikke har nogen evidens?
Der er mere. Psykiatere har ingen test til at fastslå den psykiske forstyrrelse, de stempler en med. Og de kan ikke engang definere, hvad en psykisk forstyrrelse er.
Virkelig?
De siger det endda i DSM. Se her.
Although this manual provides a classification of mental disorders, it must be admitted that no definition adequately specifies precise boundaries for the concept of mental disorder. There you go.
Ufatteligt.
Men psykiaterne var ikke færdige endnu. 14 år efter DSM-3 udgav de DSM-4. Og dens chefredaktør har været endnu mere lige frem med hensyn til psykisk forstyrrelse.
There is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it.
Så selvom de tilstod, at de ikke kan definere, hvad en psykisk forstyrrelse er, et ord, de brugte i titlen på deres egen manual, så tilføjede de endnu flere forstyrrelser.
Mange flere. 115 for at være præcis. I alt 374.
Det er mere end 3 gange så mange, som der var i DSM-1.
På bare lidt over 40 år, og bogen vejer næsten 2 kilo.
Det er mere end en telefonbog.
Det er et salgskatalog over sindslidelser, og 120 millioner mennesker i verden er blevet diagnosticeret med en sindslidelse.
Wow! Men hvad med den internationale klassifikation af sygdomme, ICD? Har den også haft en stigning i psykiske forstyrrelser?
I allerhøjeste grad. ICD's psykiske lidelser og adfærdsforstyrrelser er meget lig med DSM. Hvad end der sker i DSM, er også afspejlet der.
Okay, så nu ved jeg, at der ikke er nogen test til at bekræfte en psykisk forstyrrelse. Der er intet bevis for kemisk ubalance-teorien, og de ved ikke, hvad en psykisk forstyrrelse er.
Og de indrømmer det over for hinanden. Her taler en prominent psykiater ved en amerikansk psykiaterkonference for nylig.
You're sitting in your office, you see a depressed patient, you have no idea what's the matter with them. And I know all of you think you know the answer, but in terms of evidence, I don't know the answer, and I don't think any of us really know.
Utroligt.
Og alligevel vil de meget hurtigt give dig en diagnose. Dette er en anden indflydelsesrig psykiater ved den samme konference.
Jim Burley at the Maudsley Hospital did a study once on how long it took people to make up their mind about the diagnosis after they entered a room. And it was about, how many, David? It was 2 seconds? It was a couple of minutes. It was very...
Et par minutter?
Jeps, men selv den forhenværende præsident af den amerikanske psykiatriforening har sagt, at DSM stort set er en joke.
Well, what does D stand for? I used to think it is diagnostic, but over the last few years realized it is more like a dartboard.
Dartskive? Fortæller psykiatere deres patienter noget af det her?
Nej, faktisk opfører psykiaterne sig, som om de ved, hvad de taler om, mens offentligheden holdes hen i mørket.
I was sent to a psychiatrist who saw me again for maybe about 15 minutes, talked to me how I was doing at 7 years old, and I left with a prescription for Ritalin.
Probably within the first 15 minutes, he diagnosed me with having an anxiety disorder and put me on prescription medication.
The amount of time it took for the diagnosis was, I'd say, probably within 10 minutes I was diagnosed with anxiety, with depression, within 10 minutes of speaking to the psychiatrist, and I was put on those drugs immediately.
I received numerous different diagnoses from different doctors, and each one gave me a different drug.
I didn't have to undergo any tests. I didn't even have to sit there and I didn't have to ask any questions. It was just, that's what you've got, and this is the drug.
They really didn't talk to me. They were always talking and questioning my mother. It was all about getting the information from her and not from me.
It doesn't make sense to me. I researched it, I've done my research, and I still can't fully understand how you can diagnose somebody with a short attention span.
There was never an explanation. Nobody really knew what it was or why it was caused or how did you get it? Why did anybody have it? And what could anybody do about it? Just here, have some medicine and go away.
And I was put on, a horse's dose of an antidepressant called Effexor. 450 milligrams a day. They say if you're on 300, you're comatose.
It wasn't always Ritalin. It went from Ritalin to Wellbutrin to Concerta
to Adderall. I remember asking these doctors, is there any other way we can do this? Is there any other therapy? Is there something we can do that won't make me feel so badly, that won't give me all these side effects and just horrible sensations through my body 24 hours a day? Is there something else I can do that might be not having to do with medications? Doctor said, no. See, what you have is very complex. You have a chemical imbalance in your brain that the only thing that can correct it is medication.
Wow. Masser af diagnoser, men det eneste du får er tilsyneladende medicin.
Netop. Nu til dags er en psykiatrisk diagnose lig med psykofarmaka.
The whole question then becomes, okay, if we apply these labels, what next? And the what next tends to be, you get a prescription. And the prescription is for a drug that doesn't work very well and is toxic.
It's like a 1-2 punch. The number one of the 1-2 punch is the diagnostic manual. You've got all these disorders to choose from. The two is the treatment. So you've got the diagnostic manual in place, you've got a machinery in place, and then you've got this treatment that is there for the taking.
For everything you can think of that might seem to be odd behavior, the psychiatry field has a name for it. And then for every name of every diagnosis you have, there's going to be pharmacology behind it, and they have a pill for it.
Let me fan it out and pick a card, and there you go. Here's your label, and there's the drug that we'll give you to go along with that label.
98%, maybe 99% of people will get a diagnosis that justifies the use of a medication and also a follow-up appointment. Because remember, the business of medicine, the business of psychiatry, is seeing patients. And the psychiatrist that tells a patient they don't have a problem and there's no medicine for that problem doesn't have a very busy practice.
And that's sort of the purpose of the DSM-345, to provide a diagnosis that can be given a drug for that patient.
It's a quick buck. You don't need to do a physical exam. You put it in the chart, it's done. Prescribe away. Lifetime patient. That's what the DSM is for.
Siger de, at DSM kun er der for at retfærdiggøre behandlingen med psykofarmaka?
Det er jeg bange for.
Wow. Hvis psykiatriens primære behandlingsform er psykofarmaka, må der være masser af recepter.
Helt klart. Vidste du, at der hvert år bliver skrevet over 600 millioner recepter på psykofarmaka?
Puha. Men hvad med patienter, som ikke vil have det?
Rent faktisk har DSM også en kategori for det.
Says V15.81, non-compliance with treatment. Now this category can be used when the focus of clinical attention is non-compliance with an important aspect of treatment for a mental disorder or a general medical condition. If you refuse treatment, then you probably are mentally ill, ipso facto, by that fact alone.
Så hvis man ikke gør, hvad psykiateren siger, er det en psykisk forstyrrelse?
Netop.
Det er skræmmende. Så hvorfor vil de ikke følge behandlingen?
Fordi det, som ordineres af psykiatere, kan forårsage meget stærke og voldsomme fysiske reaktioner.
Du mener bivirkninger?
Tja, ikke rigtigt.
Drugs really don't have side effects. Drugs only have effects, and we arbitrarily differentiate those effects of the drug that we like, and we say these are the effects of the drug. And those that we don't like, those are the side effects. It's akin to saying that a bomb that comes down on a building kills people and destroys the building, and the military general says, oh, killing of the people is really a side effect. No, you cannot separate out the destroying of the building and the killing of the people. And so these are not side effects, these are direct effects of the drug creating disaster.
People think antidepressants are going to make them happy, but it's not what they do. They numb them down, and then in themselves there's a withdrawal state from the antidepressants.
They just become like robots, some of them. They're not actually able to experience the whole variety and range of human feelings and emotions and work with them and express with them and share them with others. Because once you sort of put somebody on a heavy dose psychotic drug, I mean, you're just dehumanizing them.
These are very potent, very toxic medicines, cause on themselves diabetes, high cholesterol, cause what's called a metabolic syndrome, truncal obesity, premature hardening of the arteries.
They affect the heart and the lungs and the kidneys, and you never know exactly what to expect.
Most psychotropic drugs lead to massive weight gain. Some of them, like olanzapine, for example, can lead to weight gains of 25, 30, even 40 kilos in a year or two. And that is serious.
One of the side effects is it affects your sexual performance abilities.
In people who are on a lot of medication, they're just totally unable to detoxify through their liver, and then other functions of the body shut down one by one.
These drugs have on their labels may increase risk of suicide and homicide in people who take them. Just like a carton of cigarettes has to say may be hazardous to your health.
And there's cases where many people who commit suicide or commit acts of violence are on these medications, which definitely has this type of side effect.
You look at the side effect profile is identical to what they're trying to treat, and in some cases worse, and especially in the instance of suicide, then you can see that it's an extremely treacherous area with very, very little actual science behind it.
Er det rigtigt? Disse stoffer er farlige?
Ja, og der har været tusinder, måske endda millioner af ofre, som gik til psykiater for at få hjælp, men som blev givet stoffer, der ødelagde dem. Der var Candice, der fik Zoloft, fordi hun var nervøs før eksamen. Steven, som begik selvmord 19 dage efter han begyndte på Prozac. Julie, som skulle på universitetet, hængte sig efter 7 dage på Zoloft. Matthew, der var 13, da han hængte sig. Matt, en 21-årig, der fik flere psykofarmaka samtidigt. Caitlin, der fik Zoloft og Trazodon. Beth, der fik Paxil, fordi hun havde søvnproblemer. Matt, efter han begyndte på Lexapro. Charles på Clozaril. Caitlin, en 12-årig. Megan. Aaron.
Lige et øjeblik. Det her er sindssygt. Siger du, at alle de, der tog livet af sig, tog psykofarmaka?
Ja, det er anslået 42.000 dør hvert år i forbindelse med psykofarmakabrug, mord eller selvmord.
Det er over 3.000 om måneden. Disse medicamenter skulle fjernes.
Absolut. Men fordi de er langt den mest almindelige behandling, som psykiatere tilbyder, nedtoner de risikoen. Og patienterne betaler prisen.
When you get on psychiatric drugs, you feel just like you don't really want to live anymore. Like just depressed all the time, and you feel sad.
You don't feel like you're in your own skin. It almost feels like you just want to come out of your skin all the time.
Get really bad headaches, I'd start shaking. I wouldn't sleep very well, I'd have nightmares.
I had started shaking really bad and it was like uncontrollable, you know, and it's like, I don't understand why I shake so much.
It brought on the symptoms that I was trying to escape from, very severe.
I'd go through spells where I'd just be completely just dead. There would not be me there. I'd just be standing there and there would be nothing.
I think we all have emotions, happy, sad, you know, situational emotions in life, and it didn't allow me to experience them.
You don't experience tears, you don't experience a lot of laughter. It just makes life real flatline.
I described to a friend of mine as like waking up in a manila folder and it's a cloudy day. Everything is boring, unmemorable, unspecial.
It changed me. It changed who I was. It changed the essence of my personality.
You know, it just started making me worse. And I got in such bad fights with my brother. I scratched his face up and, you know, stuff like that.
I started to experience suicidal ideations almost immediately. And I had never had any feeling like that before.
I remember when I was at home one day, I had taken my medication and I thought about killing myself. And I got really scared, so I ran to my brother and I told him, and he just held me and told me not to give up and to just keep trying.
And I actually thought that's maybe the one thing that I do have control over, that I could, you know, I could off myself, and I would be out of this roller coaster of an existence. I have been raped. I have been coerced into doing things that I do not care to speak of. But just to put it in perspective, even having experienced that, the experiences
in thoughts and loss of self that I had. Being put on Prozac was the worst violation I have ever experienced.
Jeg er målløs. Folk aner ikke engang, hvad disse stoffer gør, fordi de stoler på deres psykiater.
Ikke bare det. Nylige undersøgelser har vist, at deres stoffer, såsom antidepressiva, ikke helbreder forstyrrelser bedre end sukkerpiller, altså placebo.
Så for at opsummere, DSM giver psykiaterne den etikette, de sætter på en, og retfærdiggør, at de anvender stærke midler med bivirkninger, og som ikke engang virker. Sikke en redelighed.
Ingen tvivl om det. Og alligevel fastholder de den idé, at de kan korrigere din uønskede adfærd med kemikalier. Psykiatri appellerer naturligvis til lægemiddelindustrien, for de kan markedsføre og sælge præparater for hver forstyrrelse i DSM.
Jeg kender de kampagner. De er over det hele.
Ja, men læg mærke til, at de også markedsfører forstyrrelsen. Medicinalfirmaer reklamerer for DSM-forstyrrelser i aviser, på tv og internettet og siger, tal med din læge. De betaler eksperter for at tale på tv om de nyeste epidemier af psykiske sygdomme. De får avisartikler trykt og hyrer psykiatere til at udføre undersøgelser og skrive artikler, der vil give dem præg af videnskab.
For hvis folk tror, de har forstyrrelsen, vil de have medicinen.
Nemlig.
The pharmaceutical industry markets disorders. Because if you can market a disorder, then you've got something to sell your product to treat.
So people suddenly come to think of things they previously didn't regard as a disease state as a disease. Go to the doctor, see the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist then prescribes the drug that the drug companies have received FDA approval for. And everyone is happy except for the patient.
They're all working together, the psychiatrists, the pharmaceuticals, and one feeds the other. So again, job security for the pharmaceuticals and also job security for the psychiatrists.
Det er ikke kun medicinalfirmaerne, der promoverer disse sygdomme. En psykiater, Joseph Biederman, opfandt og populariserede en forstyrrelse, der kaldes børnebipolar. Han sagde, at den kan begynde første gang barnet åbner sine øjne.
Bipolar? Som i humørsvingninger? For børn?
Desværre ja. På kun 9 år havde Dr. Biederman fremdrevet en 40-dobling i antallet af børn, der blev diagnosticeret med bipolar, og de fleste blev ordineret kraftige antipsykotiske midler beregnet til alvorligt sindssyge.
Det anede jeg ikke.
Selv den psykiater, der redigerede DSM-4, indrømmede DSM's rolle i at skabe børnebipolarmanien.
Well, we learned some very, very painful lessons in doing DSM-4, but inadvertently, I think we helped to trigger 3 false epidemics. One for the childhood diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Lidt sent nu, ikke?
For mange børn, jo. Og da psykiatere siger, at psykiske forstyrrelser som bipolar ikke kan kureres, så har de og medicinalfirmaerne kunder resten af livet.
Så det er et naturligt partnerskab?
Helt bestemt. Medicinalfirmaer giver en masse forskningspenge til psykiatere, som så finder på flere diagnoser, der skal behandles med psykofarmaka.
Drug companies have become increasingly dependent on mental illness diagnoses in order to maintain their profit margins. And psychiatrists and increasingly clinical psychologists are more than happy to manufacture mental illness in order to make that happen. Hence, the increase in size of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The strategy is how many people we can diagnose with a particular label that would be broad enough to include a ton of people in it. And the mentality behind that is the sale of the pharmaceutical drug, which eventually becomes the treatment.
These drug companies are making a lot of money, and they're spilling that money and sending that money to people that will help support their cause. So it's not a surprise at all that they have infiltrated so many of the committees within the DSM and so much of our own medical education.
Lige et øjeblik. Medicinalfirmaerne har infiltreret komitéerne, der vedtager de forstyrrelser, der skal være i næste DSM.
56% af komitémedlemmerne på DSM-4 havde finansielle bånd til medicinalfirmaer. Industrien, som får gavn af de 115 ekstra diagnostiserbare psykiske forstyrrelser, der blev optaget ved afstemning.
Så naturligvis ser man et stigende antal diagnoser, der bliver behandlet med psykofarmaka.
Og mange flere symptomer for hver af dem.
The whole world is being made crazy, really. We have these proliferation of categories which have become more and more encompassing, encroaching in ordinary everyday life.
There isn't a human being on the planet who doesn't have at some point, if not several points, in a day or a week, distress. It's part of being human. But to say that because you have this distress, that you now are diseased.
If you take a god man in India who wanders around with a shawl and meditates for 17 hours a day, drinks rainwater and engages in some kind of spiritual or religious discipline or practice where he might roll on the ground for 100 miles to a holy place, people there don't persecute those individuals. They accept them as people engaged in religious practices. But here, if you took those same individuals in India and you had them walk across a campus in America, they would immediately be arrested and put into a psychiatric facility because they're manifesting psychosis. This varies by culture.
What do we want to straitjacket everybody? Is everyone going to be the same? What about people that do have a little bit odd behavior? Is a little odd behavior bad or dangerous? It's just different.
You want this thing to cover, all manner of aberrant human behavior. So if you can cover every bit of it, then you're going to have the best chance possible to a billable unit of service.
Og hvis du ikke passer ind i deres kategorier, er der alligevel en, de kan påhæfte dig.
Det er klart.
This is number 301.9.
312.9. 292.9.
Bipolar disorder, not otherwise specified.
Gender identity disorder, not otherwise specified.
Disorder of infancy, childhood, or adolescence, not otherwise specified.
Not otherwise specified.
What the hell does that say? They don't know.
It's kind of like a catch-all.
It's the garbage can for the leftovers.
There's even a box for people that don't fit in the other boxes.
To me, it's insane.
This is like rubbish to me.
This is scary to me.
This is hackery, quackery, dockery.
Det er ret elendig videnskab, hvis dens kategorier er så uklare, at man har brug for en diverse kategori til de løse ender.
Ja, som ADHD uden specifikation, spiseforstyrrelse uden specifikation, humørforstyrrelse uden specifikation.
You can always use the NOS, the not otherwise specified diagnosis, and that's a billable service.
Not otherwise specified means that you're sort of at sea to some extent on the exact diagnosis, meaning it doesn't fit into any of the categories you've established.
Unspecified mental disorder. You see, that's considered a disorder. Having nothing wrong with you is now a disorder. That's what this says. Can you believe it?
Nej, det er ufatteligt. Der er en kategori, der hedder uspecificeret psykisk forstyrrelse. Det vil sige, vi beskriver den ikke for dig. Er det også en psykisk sygdom?
Det bliver mere forrygt. Ifølge DSM kan man blive diagnosticeret med en psykisk forstyrrelse, der ikke er i manualen.
Du gør grin med mig.
Lyt til det her.
These diagnostic criteria and the DSM-4 classification of mental disorders reflect a consensus of current formulations of evolving knowledge in our field. They do not encompass, however, all the conditions for which people may be treated or that may be appropriate topics for research efforts.
It's even in the language of the introduction, it's basically saying we're trying to have a diagnosis to cover all the bases of anything that somebody could come in complaining about, which is, again, entirely backwards from how medical diagnoses are come to.
DSM er langt fra lægevidenskab, ikke?
Jo, det er ren marketing.
God bless the insurance company. You know, you get these multiple personalities. Oh, sure, insurance company. That's more. Insurance billing, that's the big money right there.
Der er noget, jeg ikke forstår. Hvis psykiatrisk behandling er så langvarig, dyr og ineffektiv.
Jeg ved det. Hvem er villig til at betale de svimlende summer for psykiatrisk behandling, som fortsætter i årevis? Ofte hele livet med så elendige resultater.
Akkurat. Hvem betaler for det?
Sygesikringen eller privat sygeforsikring?
Nå ja, sygesikring.
Psykofarmaka-lobbyister har været effektive i at få lovregler indført, der tvinger sygesikringen til at betale for psykiatrisk behandling på lige fod med lægebehandling.
Det, der hedder psykiatrien på finansloven, ikke?
Det er rigtigt, men økonomisk set har det været en katastrofe.
So there's nobody who walks into a psychiatrist's office that isn't going to go out with a label. He's got 374 choices or so based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual list of symptoms. So he's got to fit you into one of those categories in order to get paid.
The DSM really should be called, how to bill the insurance companies, how to get money from the insurance companies. It's a list of codes, and there's a number for everything, and that number goes on an insurance form, and then you get payment for it.
The DSM is completely built into the system now because you can't get reimbursed by an insurance company unless there's a DSM diagnosis.
You know, the kid wets the bed, you can bill on that. They're going to have one called a skin picking disorder. You pick your skin, you can diagnose and bill on that. You can always find a diagnosis and you'll always be able to bill.
Psychiatrist or psychologist can go through their book now and find a diagnosis code for just about anything. Everybody would fall into something that they could put a diagnosis on and fraud insurance companies.
Sikke et svindelnummer.
Du har helt ret. Hvert år bruger psykiatere DSM til at skrabe $100 milliarder ind fra USA's offentlige og private sygeforsikringer. Og det er bare i USA.
Jeg begynder at se, hvor meget DSM har presset omkostningerne i vejret for lægebehandling.
Jeg ved det. Forsikringskravet fra psykiatere er i snit dobbelt så stort som den fra almindelige læger.
Og det hæver min forsikring og skat.
Ja, spild af skattepenge. Det psykiatriske forsikringsprogram i Texas gik næsten konkurs på grund af en type af dyre psykofarmaka, der normalt ordineres for bipolar forstyrrelse.
Det er en masse psykofarmaka.
Mon ikke. Hvad mere er, fordi DSM-diagnoser er så vilkårlige, er der et andet stort og dyrt problem: forsikringssvindel. Private psykiatriske hospitaler er blevet fanget i at optræde som rygeafvændings- og vægttabsklinikker for at få folk til at lade sig indlægge.
Come with me.
Og de betaler værgerne $3.000 per patient, de fik sygesikring for.
How many more you got coming? A bunch.
Og de har holdt patienter indlagt så længe de kunne, indtil forsikringsdækningen udløber.
Og det er alt sammen for forsikringspengene.
Netop. Og når patienterne er indskrevet, kan en diagnose findes i DSM, der retfærdiggør behandlingen. Se de her optagelser fra et skjult kamera fra en, der udgav sig for at være sygehjælper på et psykiatrisk hospital.
I'll say patient display. That's how my opening is always a classic. Patient display. He's sort of, what do you think? You think he's
I thought I've interacted with him a lot, and I thought he's always appropriate.
Let's say, but under behavior, what's some good words in here? He's not negative. He's sort of intrusive a little bit.
Not really.
He doesn't push limits anymore.
He's really actually intrusive.
He acts sort of anxious. Focus on the negative.
And why should we focus on negative?
Because that's how they get paid. I mean, this is what they told me. I mean, you write what you want to write. I know I got to write for you. So I know what I have to write. You know what I mean? So that's why
Like, why do you have to write it?
So this place can get paid.
Okay.
It's a business thing. It's not like I'm lying, but I always pull the negative out. Like,
you're supposed to. They tell you to.
What? The negative?
Pull the negative out.
You pull it out of them.
Det kan da ikke være etisk rigtigt.
Det er det ikke, og det er kun begyndelsen af bedrageriet. Psykiatriske institutioner er blevet taget i at hæve sygesikring for at få patienter til at lytte til musik, se fjernsyn eller spille bingo, tage penge for telefonvækning, teaterbilletter, rejser til udlandet eller for påstået behandling af folk, som sad i fængsel, i koma eller enormt døde.
Nej.
Nogle psykiatere er blevet taget for at skrive regninger for at have sex med patienter og kalde det terapi.
Kvalmende.
Som en forsikringsagent sagde, omfanget af bedragerierne begrænses kun af ens fantasi.
Det anede jeg ikke.
Ikke mange ved det. Psykiatrisk svindel med forsikringsmidler og skattepenge beløber sig til $5 milliarder om året bare i USA.
De skulle fængsle disse forbrydere og smide nøglen væk.
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the third edition.
Nævnte jeg, at psykiatrien også har haft succes med at bruge DSM til at infiltrere retssystemet?
Også domstolene.
Jeps.
The clinical diagnosis of a DSM-4 mental disorder is not sufficient to establish the existence for legal purposes of a mental disorder. That's a very interesting point. Basically, what the authors are saying here is that the material in the DSM has no utility in the courtroom in deciding guilt or innocence. It should not be used in courtrooms as part of the legal process.
Lige et øjeblik. Stod der ikke lige i DSM, at den ikke kan bruges til at påvise eksistensen af en mental forstyrrelse i en retssal?
Præcis, og alligevel bliver den brugt hele tiden.
Ja, som i utilregnelighed.
Som forældrerettighedssager, tvangsindlæggelser, skifteretten.
Currently suffer from any type of mental illness that would make her a danger.
Jeg har læst om psykiatere, der møder i retten på modsatte sider, hvor begge bruger DSM til at styrke deres sag, og alligevel bliver de begge accepteret i retten som ekspertvidner.
There was no evidence, as far as I could see, for psychosis or delusions.
Because he's suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and a delusional disorder,
en fuldstændig modsigelse. Det har ikke altid været sådan.
In the beginning of the 20th century, a psychiatrist in a courtroom would be laughed out of the courtroom by and large. Today it's commonly accepted testimony as long as it's in accord with the DSM.
The danger in using the DSM in a court setting is that you're using a vocabulary that the judge or the jury doesn't fully understand. They are, by concocting these psychobabble words, it makes it seem like there's something there that may not be there.
The courts have allowed all this junk science to come into the courts, and they've made case law on it. And once the case law is made, we're stuck with it until it gets overridden.
They come in with tests. They come in with their diagnostic categories from the DSM, and they say, we've done tests, we've determined that this person has this numbered malady, and therefore they do. And there's almost no way to pry a judge out of accepting that.
When a psychiatrist makes a diagnosis in court, is that the person is sent to a mental institution, deprived of liberty, and we have no idea whether he's guilty or not.
DSM-diagnoser er basis for tvangsindlæggelse på psykiatriske institutioner, en hver 40. sekund i USA.
Det er så forkert.
Hvem som helst kan miste alt på grund af en psykiaters mening. Hør engang her.
I went to a stop smoking course at Vanderbilt. And the doctor, the lady that ran the program said that she goes, we need to get you on a stop smoking medication. So she prescribed me Zyban. Well, after the fact, I find out that Zyban is nothing but this really powerful antidepressant called Wellbutrin. Yeah, I stopped smoking, but I had no idea the hell. I mean, the hell. The hell's gates were being opened when I started taking Zyban. I had been clean and sober for 18 years. Just never considered that. But something about that, I started experiencing the craving to drink again, and my life fell apart. Divorce, relapse. So then a sibling of mine got wind of my relapse, wanted to gain control of my pocketbook and my life, and found the dirtiest lawyer in town who knew, one of the dirty psychiatrists, and bought and paid for an evaluation, had a hearing in a court before I was ever served notice. And the next thing I know, every right that a human being can possibly have was taken from me. And you have less rights as a conserved person than you do as a criminal. I mean, you are stripped of every right. You can't enter into a contract. You cannot marry. You cannot sue. You cannot even fight the legal system that has involuntarily put you in this. And it was all based on the psychiatrist's diagnosis, who never evaluated me.
Helt ufatteligt. Han forsøgte at holde op med at ryge og fik i stedet en psykiatrisk diagnose og mistede alle sine rettigheder.
Mistede også alle sine penge og blev spærret inde på en psykiatrisk afdeling. Men hvis du synes, at det psykiatere gør mod individer i retssystemet er slemt, så se, hvad der sker med familier.
Children are taken away from parents every day in these juvenile courts because a person with a PhD or an MD after their name comes in and says, I've shown ink blots to a person, and they may be a risk to a child. Just in my little state of Massachusetts here, there are 11,000 children in captivity taken away from families at any one moment. And almost all of those children are being drugged. And our own commissioner of children and families testified under oath that they drug 88% of the children that they take out of the families.
88% på psykofarmaka. Så er det næsten givet.
Og det er kun toppen af isbjerget. Psykiatere bruger domstolene overalt i verden på alle mulige måder til at fjerne folks rettigheder og ødelægge familier. Se her.
Psychiatry has affected my family through the family law court rulings. The family law court has a court-appointed child psychiatrist who, it appears, determines the future of the child.
It's just like a business in the court system that they forced you to undergo all of these psychological evaluations, and you have to pay thousands of dollars, but at the end of the day, it has been supported by no evidence, nothing.
They'd said to me, Deb, you have a choice. Either you bring your son to get medicated, or we'll take your child away from you and put him in a home that they'll medicate your child. And then good luck. Basically, they were saying, good luck, Deb, to try and get your son back, but you'll get him back medicated anyways.
And they put her in hospital, and that's when the psychotropic drugging started with Becky. And at that stage, I had no say over it.
They refused to let her go. They would not let my daughter go unless she take medication.
This was again a recommendation from the psychiatrist that once my son was radically ripped from his home and literally kidnapped and put in a new home with a perpetrator of domestic violence and of sexual assault, and is where he now lives, this psychiatrist said that he was never to have any counselling and never to see anybody.
To have your family just disrupted like that, ripped out from under you, really, your whole life, just gone like that. And then you have to fight every day to get him back. It was very devastating.
In some ways, it's worse than a death because it's unresolved and you know what the truth is. And you feel like giving up and not fighting back for that custody of that child. But you can't. There's just no justice.
Det er jo skrækkeligt. De river familier fra hinanden, baseret på vilkårlige diagnoser i retssalene.
Akkurat.
So it's unfortunate that the courts have bought into the DSM. It's unfortunate that the whole psychiatric profession is wedded to the DSM. It's unfortunate that the psychiatric profession is in bed with the drug industry, and it's unfortunate that drugs that don't work are the common prescribed drugs for all manner of conditions in children and in adults. It's the wrong way to go.
Nej, ikke også dem.
Desværre jo. Børn er blevet en stor målgruppe for psykiatrien. Antallet af barndomsforstyrrelser givet i DSM er steget voldsomt fra 3 forstyrrelser i 1952 til 44 i dag.
Det er 15 gange så mange.
Og dog indrømmer DSM, at den ikke bør diagnostisere børn.
In early childhood, it may be difficult to distinguish symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from age-appropriate behaviors in active children, such as running around or being noisy. We basically don't know the diagnosis from normal childhood. That's what that's saying.
Opmærksomhedsforstyrrelse. Det er, hvad psykiaterne kalder det, når børn ikke sidder stille i klassen, er urolige, løber eller kravler meget. Dybest set barndomsadfærd, ikke?
Netop. Og 20 millioner børn verden over er blevet stemplet med en eller anden psykisk forstyrrelse.
Så i stedet for at lade børn være børn,
fortæller psykiatere nu forældre, at deres børn er psykisk syge og har brug for psykofarmaka.
It used to be that you were on the playground, you'd have the weird kid, you had the shy kid, you had the goof off, you had the hyper kid. You can't have that anymore. Now it's all medical diagnoses.
For them to come up with new diseases and new issues and diagnosis in their book, it doesn't correct bad behavior, okay? They can give children all the pills they want. It still doesn't correct bad behavior.
The thinking still is, you must fit into this mold. And if you don't fit into this mold, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not the person who designs the mold, too bad for you.
A child is labeled and then they're brought to professionals who are trained a very particular way. They're all being trained that if the child fits into this category, then we should consider putting them on Ritalin because that's what they do. That is the protocol.
The way the Ritalin will be marketed to the parents is that they will say, this is a drug to calm your child down. What they won't say is that methylphenidate is a form of speed. It's a form of amphetamine, and what we're actually doing is overdosing your child on speed.
It's a stimulant. So naturally it's going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and you put a kid out on a football field on a hot summer day, and his risk of having a cardiac event of some sort has just gone up.
Jeg hørte, at stimulanser, der bliver givet til børn, der er diagnosticeret med opmærksomhedsproblemer, kemisk set ligner kokain.
Ja, og der er så store muligheder for misbrug, at USA's myndigheder har opført det i samme kategori som morfin, opium og metamfetamin.
Og hvem er de næste psykiaterne vil medicinere? Babyer?
Akkurat. De bruger det, de kalder diagnostisk klassifikation 0-3 eller DC 0-3. Det er en slags mini-DSM for babyer og småbørn. Hør engang her.
We already targeted our school children with ADHD and bipolar. That's already done. That was done 20 years ago. And we're moving younger with DC03 to the 0 to 3 age group where they're trying to make popular the idea that it's okay to medicate 0 to 3-year-olds.
The idea of a program to determine whether a child from birth to the age of 3 has a mental illness is so preposterous, so absolutely insane, that it's simply an additional part of the insanity that is now extant throughout this country. I cannot think of a program that is more insane than that.
How are they going to diagnose a 1-year-old or an infant with a psychological disorder? How do they know?
You almost have to ask ourselves, if our societies become sick, what are we doing to our fetuses, our infants, our children, that would make us need to have psychiatric medications?
We're rolling dice with life. We're rolling dice with our children who can't even discuss it with anybody. They have no control. They are the helpless victims, and the ones who are supposed to protect them and care aren't armed with the facts.
Hvis forældrene vidste alt det her, ville de blive rasende.
Det er helt sikkert. Men pas nu på, fordi DSM siger også, at du kunne blive smittet med en psykiatrisk sygdom for dine børn.
Det mener du ikke?
det er i DSM.
We're going to talk about some of the proposed changes that are suggested for DSM-5.
Jeg hørte, at DSM-5 er endnu mere forrygt end DSM-4.
Du hørte rigtigt.
You've got 374 named diagnoses in DSM. Well, guess what? There's going to be more in DSM-5.
Why do we all of a sudden need a fifth DSM-5? Psychiatry wanted to broaden the horizons of mental health problems, of disorders. They wanted to stretch the disorders so it would encompass more. And to do that, they're going to add more diagnoses.
We need more diagnoses. We need more diagnoses like we need a hole in the head, really. They're not serving a purpose for mankind, all these diagnoses. They're almost laughable, some of the diagnoses.
Komiske? Virkelig?
Tja, de kalder det en hamstringsforstyrrelse, hvis man ikke smider nok ting væk.
Persistent difficulty discarding or parting with personal possessions.
Overspisningsforstyrrelse, hvis du ofte spiser for meget.
Recurrent episodes of binge eating.
Og så er der hudpilleriforstyrrelse.
So it's recurrent skin picking resulting in skin lesions.
Er det en psykisk forstyrrelse?
Og for børn er der en ny forstyrrelse, som vil skovle masser af børn ind, hvis anfald endnu ikke kvalificeres som bipolar.
They've created temper dysregulation disorder to seem a little bit more mild of the condition and include a lot of the younger population in terms of that diagnosis. And what it essentially does, it just broadens bipolar disorder into a whole other new category. And where they don't fit into bipolar, now they can fit into this other diagnosing criteria.
Så fangnettet gøres større og større.
Mere end du tror. De overvejer endda at tilføje en betegnelse for at bruge for meget tid med din computer.
Internet addiction diagnosis. It's another example of, just taking something going on in the popular culture that's, pretty widespread, and then finding a way to pathologize it.
I know people personally that spend 12, 13, 14 hours a day on the internet or social networking groups like Facebook. So there is something going on there. But is it a condition that we need to then label and drug? Absolutely not.
Det er helt inde i vejret.
Ja, indtil man ser på, at myndighederne i Kina allerede har sat psykiatriske klinikker op, der behandler teenagere for problematisk computerbrug, og nogle gange bruger elektrochok for at kurere dem.
Nej.
Og hvis du synes, det er slemt, så er der et andet forslag til næste udgave af DSM, som er virkelig skræmmende.
Det bliver værre.
Denne her tager diagnoser af psykiske sygdomme et stort skridt videre. Psykoserisikosyndromet, i den senere tid bedre kendt under det mere snørklede navn, dæmpede psykosesymptomer-syndromet.
Det er en mundfuld, men hvad betyder det?
A really scary thing that's coming on the horizon is to come up with a whole bunch of diagnoses in there that are looking at people who currently are mentally well adjusted but have a risk of developing a mental illness in the future.
They're still thinking they can define well before the symptoms develop the risk of a person developing a major mental disorder without any biochemical, biological or genetic test or any physical test whatsoever.
They don't know the cause of a mental illness. They can't treat it, they can't cure it. So how can they launch a preventative campaign for mental illness? It just logically, it falters.
Lige et øjeblik. Tror psykiatere virkelig, at de kan forudsige en fremtidig forstyrrelse?
Lad os høre det fra dem.
How can psychiatrists know if you're going to have a mental disorder in the future?
Again, that we don't know categorically who will develop psychiatric illness in the future.
It's really hard to say, actually. I don't know if you could 100% predict for anybody.
You can't forecast if one will develop a psychiatric disorder.
Maybe not, or maybe yes.
It's hard to predict.
It's hard to predict.
There's no way to predict that.
I don't think that nobody knows that.
There's no way to tell.
Nobody knows?
I don't think anyone can know what's going to happen in the future.
De aner det overhovedet ikke.
Nej, men til trods for det foreslår de allerede at screene børn for fremtidige psykiske sygdomme.
Så de kan behandle dem nu?
Lige netop.
I would hate to see us go into the type of society where people are
locked up for what they may do in the future, rather than what they actually have done.
Identifying people who are pre-psychotic would be a huge industry.
Wow, det er meget skræmmende.
Og det skøre er, at psykiatere stadig arbejder på DSM-5, selvom nogle af deres mest indflydelsesrige folk åbent indrømmer, at den er fuldstændig værdiløs.
Any comment on DSM-5? It's of no use to us in the rest of the world.
Selv psykiateren, der leder USA's Institut for Psykisk Sundhed, er mindre end entusiastisk om den.
I don't do DSM. I'm not involved. So, and that maybe tells you more than anything. NIMH is not involved with DSM.
Så spidsen af den største psykiatriske organisation i verden vil ikke have noget med DSM at gøre.
Det ser sådan ud. Det er komplet humbug.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is effectively the story that is being wrapped up in statistics and numbers and categories that when medicine tosses, doesn't fit any of our categories over to psychiatry, psychiatry says we'll find a category, and if we don't, DSM-5 or 6 or 7 will.
I think in 2016 we'll be looking at DSM-6 and there will be 1,425 diagnoses and I'll have 900 of them.
Det er bims.
Ja, men det hele er beregnet på at passe flere og flere ind under psykiatriens diagnostiske paraply.
Så de kan skrabe endnu mere ind på normal adfærd.
Lige netop.
Så hvis DSM er så ubrugelig, hvorfor er psykiaterne så... jeg forstår. Det handler alt sammen om penge, ikke?
Med psykiatrien handler det altid om penge. Og det begynder alt sammen med DSM. Robert Spitzer sagde...
The American Psychiatric Association found out it could make a lot of money by selling it. They've made a tremendous amount of money.
Every time they revise the DSM system, the American Psychiatric Association makes a hell of a lot of money.
En fandens masse penge. Hvor meget taler vi om?
Salget er på $6,5 millioner hvert år.
Wow!
Men det er ikke kun salget, som indtjener profitten. Psykiatere og medicinalfirmaer tjener penge, hver gang de stiller en diagnose på nogen.
You create disorders so that you can treat it with a drug. It's the ultimate money-making machine.
How many people can we drug? How many labels can we put out there? How many people can we herd into these labels and feed them a drug so we can get richer, make more money?
There's an inherent conflict of interest, and that conflict of interest is driven by the desire to make money. More money, more money, more money than one should expect.
Huge money in the psychopharm business. If you really did the research on these diagnoses, see that 90% of them or more don't exist. They're not valid. Then that's all of a sudden, all that reimbursement from the insurance companies disappears.
So we have to cut the money cord, as well as cutting the DSM cord if we're ever going to really succeed stopping this juggernaut from continuing.
Once again, it's follow the money. And you'll get your answer every time.
Det har virkelig åbnet mine øjne. Lad os se. Der er ingen laboratorietester for såkaldte psykiske forstyrrelser, og disse kan psykiaterne ikke engang selv definere i deres egen manual. Den kemiske ubalanceteori er fup, og alligevel bliver psykofarmaka, som de hævder vil afbalancere kemikalierne i hjernen, ordineret til folk i alle aldersgrupper.
Det beløber sig til $84 milliarder om året, hvilket har øget forsikringspræmierne med $10 milliarder alene i USA.
Og vi betaler for alt dette med skatter og større betalinger til vores sygeforsikringer.
Det er rigtigt. Den psykiatriske industri bruger DSM til at skrabe $330 milliarder ind om året.
Det er næsten en tredjedel af $1 billion.
Og det stiger stadig. Det er helt ukontrolleret.
Well, the whole system is now a runaway train, but the DSM is the locomotive. And if you took the locomotive off, eventually the train would stop, because there'd be nothing more pulling it.
We're losing the concept of health. Everybody is sick and everybody's got a condition and everybody needs drugs.
You're going to end up with a whole society that's going to basically have to be led around by the hand. But who's going to lead them around? Because they're drugging so many of them.
In psychiatry, you know in your heart of hearts that you're not really diagnosing. You know in your heart of hearts that you can't really treat what you think might be wrong. And you also know that most of what you're dealing with in the DSM is unprovable and unreliable, not a predictable indicator. So what do you have then?
Godt spørgsmål. Jeg går ud fra, at de ikke har noget.
Og det skader folk.
Ja.
You're very lucky to go through psychiatry and survive. It really is as simple as that.
Only when enough people rip the veneer away and show that it's just nothing more than a Hollywood set is it ever going to fall down.
It would be good if all the medical professionals who are really practicing medicine and really trying to help people and based on scientific fact and what they can best do to improve the lives of others, if they would recognize, just be able to look at this fact. It's hard to look at it, but look at this fact and be ethical and be honest and clean up the profession by getting rid of this fraudulent part of it. Psychiatry.
Jeg kunne ikke have sagt det bedre selv. Det er så indlysende, at vi må komme DSM til livs. Den er forfærdelig for samfundet.
Jeg ved det. Trods dens utroligt svage fundament har diagnostisk og statistisk manual påvirket enhver del af vores verden.
Vores skoler, statsmagten,
retssystemet.
Hvad med medierne og militæret?
Også dem.
I realiteten hele samfundet.
Og alt sammen uden at kurere én eneste person.
DSM er mere end bare et korthus.
Den diagnostiske og statistiske manual er psykiatriens mest dødbringende svindelnummer.